In question 1, we're given 8 situations where we need to determine whether it's a private cost or benefit or an external cost or benefit. If it's an external cost or benefit, it only applies to those outside of the buyer and supplier. And if it's a private cost or benefit, then it applies only to buyer and or supplier. So if it applies to me, it's a private cost or benefit. If it applies to my neighbor or anyone else, it's an external cost or benefit. So in part A, we have the price you pay for an iTunes download. That's a private cost. It only applies to me. Part B, we have a benefit your neighbor receives from hearing you play your pleasant music. It's an external benefit because it applies to your neighbor and it's a benefit for them. C, the annoyance of your neighbor because he doesn't like your achingly conventional music. It's an external cost. It applies to the neighbor, not me, and they hate it, so it's an external cost. D, the pleasure you receive from listening to your iTunes download. It's a private benefit. It applies to me, and it's a good thing. E, the price you pay for a security system for your home is a private cost because I have to pay, and it only applies to me. F, the safety you enjoy as a result of having the security system is a private benefit because I benefit from it. It's only me. G, the crime that is more likely to occur to your neighbor once a criminal sees protected by alarm sticker on your window. It's an external cost because it applies to my neighbor and they're suffering for it. And part H, the extra safety your neighbor might experience because criminals tend to stay away from neighborhoods that have a lot of burglar alarms. It's an external benefit because it applies to them and they're benefiting from it. Part 2, we are giving situations where we have to determine whether it's an external benefit or cost and estimate its size, and then we have to decide whether we need a tax or subsidy as a simple way to compensate for externality. So in part A, we have a market of automobiles. The private benefit of one more SUV is $20,000. The social cost of one more SUV is $30,000. It's an external cost because social cost minus private benefit equals external cost. So $3,000 minus $20,000 equals $10,000, and we would need a tax to balance the cost. In part B, we have we are given a situation where we have fashionable clothes. The marginal social benefit of one more dress per person is $100, while the marginal private benefit is $500. The dress can be made from Eastern lowland gorilla fur, which creates external cost because the marginal social benefit is the addition between marginal private benefit and the marginal external benefit. So 100 minus 500 is 400. This would endanger eastern lowland gorillas and create ripple effects in the ecosystem, coming back to our economy costing us $400. We would need a Pregovian tax to balance that cost. In part C, in the market of really good ideas that will dramatically change the world, the private benefit of one more really good idea is 1 million, while the marginal social benefit is 1 billion. So in this case, the external benefit would be 1 billion minus 1 million, which is 999 million, and we would need a Pregovian subsidy in this situation because the external benefit would be the marginal social benefit minus the marginal private benefit, 1 billion minus 1 million.
In question 3, we're looking at questions dealing with Coase's theorem, deciding whether or not a specific situation meets the criteria to strike an efficient deal. For part A, the situation is a neighbor asking someone to cut down the ugly shrub in their yard as it reflects negatively on both parties and the neighborhood as a whole. Because property rights are well defined, the shrub is clearly owned by one party, and the cost of cutting down the shrub is pretty low, plus curb appeal of the houses may go up, the two can strike an efficient deal here. Part D is somewhat similar, but the neighbors are asking for a lot more than Part A. As a result, Coase's theorem doesn't apply. The transaction costs, painting the house and filling up a ditch, are far too high to be a good deal for both parties. Part C moves on to an example of an electricity plant pouring hot water into a lake where local homeowners are concerned about all the natural fish dying. Coase's theorem isn't going to apply here either. The homeowners don't own the lake as it's generally the property of the local township or city, and the transaction costs of finding a new place for the hot water could potentially be very high, so the parties won't make an efficient deal here. And finally, for Part D, we're looking at another plant pouring hot water into a river near a fishery. Here, though, the fishery's property on the river is well defined, and the transaction cost of dumping the water just a little more upstream to keep the fish alive is relatively low, so the two can come to an efficient deal. Moving to question 4, we're trying to find the most efficient way to combat specific problems. Part A's problem is that cars like SUVs guzzle more gas and cause more pollution than other cars, so it proposes a tax on SUVs. This is not the most efficient solution, though, as there are other cars that pollute just as much or even more than SUVs that consumers could easily switch to. A better tax would be one on gas itself. Part B asks about taxing 24-hour liquor stores to combat unruliness nearby, but that also won't directly solve the problem, as liquor can be bought ahead of time or at different locations. A better tax is one on alcohol itself. Part C proposes a tax on bell-bottom jeans to make sure that their intense ugliness is reduced. This would actually work because consumers can buy different jeans that look far better, and this hits the source of this problem. And lastly, Part D asks about a tax on TV shows based on the number of profane words said. This would also work well at hitting the source of the issue, because few television shows are going to waste that much money for a few words here and there that can be avoided easily.
In question 5, Maxicon is opening a new coal power plant, but it's under government pressure to reduce pollution. So what is the more efficient way? Making them use one particular air scrubbing technology that will reduce pollution by 25%, or letting them reduce it by 20% any way they want? Well, it's definitely going to be the latter, because if you give them the opportunity to choose their way to reduce pollution, they're going to choose the most cost-effective way, and it's ultimately going to be the most effective in the economy. If a corrupt government grants Maxicon all tradable pollution permits in the entire nation, what would happen? Well, Maxicon would continue to use pollution units until the marginal revenue of using one more unit exceeds, or the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue. So they only use enough pollution to maximize their total profit, then they stop. In question 6, a flu shot typically can cost about $25 to $50. But why might a firm prefer to offer its employees flu shots free? If the flu shots are free, then it removes transactional costs, and that's roughly equivalent to a wage increase of the same amount. So the company gains from the social benefits of the decreased number of sick employees after the widespread flu shots. For question 7, the environment is priceless. This is wrong. People put a price on the environment all the time because they have to figure out how much pollution is costing society, and they find an amount of pollution that maximizes social benefit. So it actually is beneficial to our economy to have some pollution, but it has to be the right amount. So if the environment were priceless, there would be zero pollutants because they would not be cost effective, but they are to an extent.
Now let's go ahead and look at question 8, which is a very interesting question on the cultural influences caused by romance novel reading, as well as the external costs brought by those romance novel reading. And so for part A, we're asked to illustrate the effect of the unrealistic expectations resulting from romance novel reading on the society. And so marked here by the red arrow is our external costs. For part B, we want to illustrate the debt weight loss from the externalities. So here we marked it as the green triangle. As we can see, without tax or other solutions, we actually have some debt weight loss. Now, if we want to try to mitigate the effect, a tax is desirable. So the tax should not be so high that it deters novel reading and stops it once for all, but there are social benefits to reading. So since our goal here is to offset the external costs resulting from romance novel reading, the tax should be just high enough to offset the cost, but not too high that it discourages all kinds of novel reading. So to illustrate that, we have the necessary tax amount marked here in teal on the graph, and that is going to be the same amount as external costs, and so that will enable us to bring the curves to an efficient equilibrium for the society. The last part of question 8 wants us to talk about where the money is going matters. So we said that the government doesn't necessarily need to directly use the money gained from that tax to address the social effects of romance novels. As mentioned in the textbook, we know that benefits are benefits regardless of who receives them. It's to the society, and so the amount of net social good we get will still be the same, even if the government spends that amount of money on roads and bridges. For question 9, we have a government which knows exactly the amount of pollution that should be allowed, and it wants to decide whether it's better to use tradable allowances or a tax. And they want the max level of revenue. Since we know that we will end up at the same efficient price and equilibrium no matter which method we use, as noted in the textbook, the tax revenue amount is going to be the black shaded area. And since the most someone will pay for the right to pollute at the efficient level is exactly at the efficient price, the green area represents the amount of revenue that will be generated if the government sells tradable allowances. And so in this scenario, tradable allowances would be more desirable.